We're going to welcome you all to the QPW and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on LGBTQ Rights webinar today. I'm just going to let a few seconds pass for people to come into the room, and we'll start very shortly. Okay, welcome everybody to the Queer Politics webinar. I should note that we're just attempting to get Katie Hill to join us on screen. She's having a slight problem with the link, but thank you so much for joining us for this quite innovative and unusual session. I'm very excited to welcome our panelists today, and I will introduce them in a second. But I should thank Anna Robinson and Crispin Blunt, and also Baroness Barker from the All-Party Parliamentary Group, who have helped facilitate this session with us in the United Kingdom. And obviously we're based here at Princeton University in the United States, but very interested in global dimensions of LGBTQ rights. So many of you will perhaps wonder why the webinar is focused so specifically today on women who identify as bisexual or pansexual in elected office. And I think that for those of you who've experienced the political navigation and social navigation of being bi or pan, you'll know that this is an increasingly relevant issue to public policy and politics in the world today. The actual bisexual, pansexual share of the LGBTQ population is growing dramatically, growing very quickly. And the share of that are women identifying as bi and pan is even more dramatic in its growth, leading to the point where over half in most surveys of the LGBTQ population around the world identify as bisexual or pansexual. But of course, the reality is that the actual amount of stigma, of discrimination, of marginalization remains pervasive around the world, in the global north and the global south as well. And bisexual people or pansexual people are much less likely to be out. There is erasure within the community itself, but also in the society writ large. And the indicators for bi and pan people, where we have those indicators, is sometimes even worse than the negative indicators of health or marginalization than for gay and lesbian Americans or British people or Europeans. So there is a big disjuncture between the visibility of the community, the size of the community, and the problems faced by that community. What we know is that people in leadership roles who are visible are incredibly important for a whole variety of marginalized communities, because they empower, they liberate, they reassure. If you see somebody who looks like you in public office, then you are reassured that you have the aspirations to be a leader, to be satisfied within your life. And so role modeling, and we have some important role models with us today, are literally lifesavers in many ways. I mean, they communicate to the young teen girl who is unable to navigate a harsh society that there is opportunity, there is hope in the future. There have only been 16 out bisexual women parliamentarians in history. There are 11 in office today. So this is a relatively small community, and we have some of the leading figures with us on the Zoom today, and we welcome Katie Hill. I shall introduce our panelists briefly before turning to questions. And as I said, what we'd like to do is have a conversation to begin with for the first sort of 25 minutes, and then please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try and get to as many of those questions as possible. I will pose those questions to our panelists in the second half of the hour. So Katie Hill, and apologies for making you wait in the green room for a little while. Hi.
That was my fault with the link, but hello everybody, great to be here. Thank you so much.
So Katie was only the second out bisexual person elected to the US Congress. I think many of you will know that she has navigated biphobia, misogyny with courage and grace and generosity. She now runs the PAC Her Time and remains a highly visible leader, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for progressive politics in the US and beyond. Sarah McBride is the highest ranking elected official in America today who happens to be transgender. We could list a whole slew of firsts by Sarah's name on her resume, speaking at national conventions, White House intern. But to me, I think the first that matters is that she is often the first person I think about when I think of an elected official who has both policy smarts, but deep empathy and generosity. So Sarah is obviously one of the up and coming stars of American politics today. Annie Hoey is a senator in Ireland. She was elected in 2020 on the agricultural panel for the Labour Party in Ireland. She is a former president of the Irish Students' Movement, and she was active in the Repeal the Eighth campaign about reproductive rights in the Republic of Ireland. She's also been more recently leading campaigns for fair wages for nurses, student nurses and midwives in Ireland today. She is actually the first, to my knowledge, out bisexual member of the Irish Parliament. And finally, Nadia Whittome is the British Member of Parliament for the Labour Party for Nottingham East. Again, it is our understanding that she is the first out queer person of Sikh ancestry elected in the world. She is the youngest member of the House of Commons, and she's led more recently on issues of healthcare, anti-racism work, and transgender rights. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do is begin this conversation about the experiences of out by pan women in elected office around the world today. And I'd like to start with Katie. And it would be really interesting if you could just give us a little bit of information on how you navigated the intersections of your gender, your sexual orientation, and being a highly prominent, visible elected official in the US Congress. Did being bisexual affect your experience in Congress and your experiences in when you left Congress, and also the relationship between your peers in Congress, but also the constituents? I mean, how did being bisexual color all those experiences?
Sure. I guess I can start with the very beginning when I made the decision to run as an openly bi person, because that was a, that was a real factor. At the time I was married to a man, and visibly, as most people as most bisexual people ultimately end up in a monogamous relationship of some kind, they're usually identified as, from the outside perspective, at least, they're either identified as gay or straight most of the times, unless they make a point of saying something or people know them well and have known them for a long time. So for me, it was, I talked to other LGBT leaders, and specifically I was close to a few lesbians who had been, really trailblazers in California politics. And I said, I'm bisexual, and I think it's really important to my own identity that I run this way. And they said, you are in a hard district. My district, for those who remember what Prop 8 was, Proposition 8, it was the gay marriage ban in California. And it was 2008. So it was not that long ago. It was only 10 years before I was elected in 2018. And at that point, my district voted so they voted to ban gay marriage in California by a 2/3 majority. So it was incredibly on the conservative leaning side. And so when I talked about it and decided to run as openly bi, I was told not to. Even by people in the LGBT community said, why would you do that? There's no reason for you to. You don't need to. And I ultimately decided, look, no, that's an important part of my identity, and I feel like doing so is part of what makes it possible. What makes it possible for other younger people, queer people, to feel like it's possible for them to run too. And but throughout the campaign, it's not like I made some big announcement, right? Like, hey guys, I'm bi, but it became a normal part of conversations when it came up. And I got to tell you, especially, and these are supporters. I'm not talking about, necessarily adversaries, but supporters just asked some of the strangest questions and had reactions that you really did not even know what to do with. And I found myself explaining what bisexuality was to a lot of wealthy women in their 60s and 70s and 80s that simply had not been exposed to it before. Once I got into Congress, I think that I would say that it's similar kind of vein, but most people didn't really address it, didn't really talk about it until the scandal happened and everything hit the fan. And that, I would say, was when, the nastiness really showed up in every possible way, whether it was going towards my office, towards me personally, towards people who were close to me in my personal life. And that was when you really saw the biphobia in action. But, even being part of the Equality Caucus, for example, or being, when you talk about women when people would reference like gay women in Congress, I would often get left off of the list. People would forget that I'm part of the LGBTQ members in office because you're just kind of overlooked, and they'd list the lesbians, and then someone would be like, Katie Hill too. And then whoever it was, whether it was the speaker or somebody else, would be like, oh yeah, and Katie. So I just think it shows you that despite the fact that so many of us identify this way now, we're still often overlooked, and it's not yet normalized. There's this taboo aspect of it. There's this part where people think that, oh, you haven't decided. I still get that from, you just haven't made up your mind yet. And I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen, that there's a mind to be made up. And you got that from your colleagues. You got that throughout the campaign, from your supporters, and so on and so forth. So it's just another dynamic to deal with. And I'm sure I can't wait to hear others' experiences.
No, thank you. And I'm sure we're going to come back to this issue of erasure and the complications and confusions. I wanted to ask Sarah McBride, obviously you are so prominent as a person who is transgender in the public eye. What's the intersection between your sexual orientation and your gender identity in the way you're perceived, the way people communicate with you? It's almost like there's a conflation in the mind's eye of constituents and colleagues as well. How do you navigate that difference in identities?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on, Andy. It's so exciting to be on with three incredible leaders. Annie and Nadia, thank you for the work that you both are doing over in Ireland and the UK. And Nadia, you have your hands full over in the UK with what's going on with trans rights there. And so I applaud you for that. And when Andy mentioned that, it reminded me of probably one of my favorite moments working in the LGBTQ movement in the United States, which was sitting in the House of Representatives gallery on the day of the vote for the Equality Act and watching Katie Hill give one of the most, I think, badass responses to the Republican opposition, which focused on trans youth and sports. And Katie, for me, seeing that as a trans person, knowing that there was no one like me in that chamber, seeing you, though, stand up and so clearly, and I think just so fluently defending trans rights was really moving for me, and was frankly the highlight of the entire day, including the actual passage.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to make sure I said that before we dove into things even more. But, you know, Andy, it's interesting because I think I've been on probably hundreds of panels around LGBTQ equality. And this is the first time in my entire career where I have ever been included for my sexual orientation, not my gender identity. And the interplay between the two is that one completely eclipses the other. I think that's a byproduct of two factors. One, I think it's a byproduct of people's lack of understanding of the differences between gender identity and sexual orientation, and just the perception that transness is sort of an extreme version of gayness or queerness or of sexual orientation. But I also think it's a byproduct of the fact that obviously my gender identity just looms so large, you know, to the point where it eclipses my party affiliation. Someone said that they knew I was trans before they knew I was a Democrat, although here in the States, it's pretty obvious how those go hand in hand unless you're Caitlyn Jenner. But the fact that my gender identity eclipses my sexual orientation is something I frankly think about almost every day, because every single time I am thinking about engaging in a conversation about relationships, every single time I'm engaging in any kind of conversations around my social life with colleagues, I always wonder, is this added information just going to blow their minds? You know, it's so hard for so many people in our politics, in our world, to wrap their mind around my gender identity, that when I throw in that I'm a member of the Bi+ community, I can just see their heads almost literally exploding. And so it's a difficult dynamic to navigate, because, you know, I'm very proud of who I am. I'll also be candid that my understanding of my sexual orientation has evolved while I've been in the public work that I've done. But I try to be mindful, and I feel like I do have to pick and choose, because I'm already dealing with this incredibly, I think, complicated concept for people. And in any moment where I bring in my sexual orientation, whether that's me, if I identified as straight, whether that's if I identified as gay, or if I identify or as a member of the Bi+ community, I'm always hesitant to bring in my sexual orientation, because I can see that it both confuses people. And I'll never forget when I was standing in front of the Delaware State Senate, and we were defending against these anti-trans attacks, fighting for the gender identity non-discrimination bill we pushed forward. And of course, they were talking about the caricature of trans women being predators in restrooms. And I was deeply upset, and I wanted to raise in front of that chamber as the witness that I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and it was incredibly offensive of me. And one of the advocates, I think, unfortunately, rightly said, it's probably a mistake to sexualize you anymore. And that advice is also constantly in my mind in the context of any conversation about my sexual orientation, because of its interplay with my gender identity.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to ask Senator Hoey, Annie, about is this issue of navigating something that's quite distinctive and new. I mean, you're the 12th out person elected to the Irish Parliament. You're only the second out woman. But as I said earlier, I think you're the first out bisexual person elected to the Irish Parliament. And sometimes from watching you on social media, it almost feels like you're shouting loud just to remind people about this dimension of your life, to the point where you even, as your Wikipedia backdrop page, have your so your Twitter backdrop is your Wikipedia entry that says Annie Hoey is bisexual. So, I mean, how are you trying to not be defined by this, but at the same time be authentic when you interact with your colleagues in Parliament?
Sorry, it kind of cut off just for a very second there, and you were in the middle of the Wikipedia part, and then suddenly my screen froze, and I'm like, oh no, what happened? I've been kicked out of this iconic group of people. Disaster.
No, what, just to finish that question, I mean, just trying to understand how you seem to be constantly having to work hard just to remind people that you are an out LGBTQ plus member of Parliament, and you know, I mean, you don't want to be defined by it. That is not who you are as a person or a politician, but it's part of the colors that bring you to the table. How do you navigate that sort of need to be present, but also not overplay that?
Yeah, and it is quite. I'm always very aware of the, you know, the joke. How do you know someone's bisexual? They tell you, you know, like these things that we're being really pushy by telling people and reminding people, and people never think that that's because we are constantly misjudged. You know, I'm engaged to a man, a cisgendered man, so it's very easy for people to not know about my sexual orientation, despite the fact that I built my entire career on it, but that's fine. You know, the entire thing through the student movement was marriage equality and getting involved, but whatever. And I think it really came because when I was running for the agricultural panel, also everyone was like, a gay person on the agricultural panel, what now? But we have an internal nomination system, and all of the people who are contesting it were members of the LGBT community for the Labour Party internal nomination. But everyone talked about that it was great that there were two gay men running. And there was just no mention of the fact that, first of all, it's great to have a woman running for an agricultural thing. And second of all, that I was also a member of the LGBT community. You know, the Labour Party were very proud of our LGBT history. We were the ones who pushed for marriage equality. We were doing it, you know, long before it was cool and trendy. And so there was a really big thing being like, we like to have that representation. It's really important, but just not her, because we don't think she's the right kind of I don't think anyone thought it through that way, but I was just kind of not included. And a lot of, you know, the youth kind of wing of the party who I would have known through LGBT activism and stuff were like, well, she's kind of one of the gang there, guys. So I think ever since then, I've almost felt this pressure to have this representation, because just as I was coming into national politics, it was almost whipped away from me. So I'm very defensive of it. I'm also very aware of the fact, as you said, it's the second only out woman, the first only out bisexual, that I do feel that there's a responsibility for young queer people, for whom that is my community, that's my home, the LGBT community is my home, I feel much more at home there, that they see someone on a regular basis who is speaking about their issues, who talks about their pronouns in Parliament, who talks about trans issues, who, when I see homophobia happening to the gay members of Parliament, you know, I'll call that out as well. You know, and you know, be part of that narrative. And I think that's important. And the reason, and I didn't put it into my Wikipedia. Someone else put it into my Wikipedia, and I just thought it was an absolute riot. And so that's why I have the screenshot. But I'm not entirely sure how to fully navigate it without being that obnoxious, loud bisexual person, but I don't really care, because people push it aside so much, and I'm really proud of that. My partner is very proud of that part of our history. We met at an LGBT events. It's part of who our relationship is, and I don't want that to be erased. I think it's really important that bisexual people when they choose a partner, aren't pushed into that identity forevermore. So I guess I'm going to navigate it by just keep talking about it and working with those LGBT youths so that they know that there is someone like them in Parliament, and that, you know, your gender identity is as valid to be a part of you. I think a lot of people say your sexual identity or gender identity, you know, like we don't care. Actually, I care. I care a lot about the fact that I'm bisexual. I care a lot about the fact that I'm a woman, and I'm not going to have that silenced by people who don't want me to talk about it. If you don't want me to talk about it, don't follow me, don't listen. That's fine. That's how I navigate it. I'm not going to do a thing about it. I'm going to keep talking.
And I thank you. And I wonder if that resonates with Nadia in the sense that I got the impression watching from the outside that there was a moment, you know, a few months ago in Britain where you and some colleagues sort of not coordinatedly, but just felt there was a time you needed to stand up and be counted because Charlotte Nichols and Olivia Blake and yourself sort of came out as bisexual at a similar in a few week period. And can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking behind sort of becoming more, well, perhaps you always were, but just stressing that part of you in the media and sort of being comfortable being identified as part of the cohort in the British Parliament?
I mean, Olivia, Charlotte and I are all really good comrades, but actually we didn't intend to sort of come out at the same time, and I don't want to speak for them, but I never really think of myself as coming out, you know, just because someone discovers something about me. I was never in, but people found out, which is fine and nice. But for me, I think I was very honoured and privileged to be elected or chosen as the Pink News Politician of the Year alongside Layla Moran, and we're both BIPAN, queer, bi plus women. So as part of that, I spoke about queerness and my allyship with the trans community, but also my identity as a queer woman myself. And then shortly afterwards, I was asked to be on the front cover of Galdem magazine, which for people, I don't know how big Galdem is in the US, but in the UK it's massive, particularly among like women and non-binary people of colour and people of our generation. So that was really exciting. And that gave me a platform to speak about my queerness as being integral to my identity as a woman of colour. And also I just looked queer as hell on the front cover, so that would have outed me anyway. I kind of think that so there was a lot to navigate for me, as there is for all of us on this panel in lots of different ways. And actually, when I was making notes for this, I sort of got overwhelmed with just how much there is from lots of different angles. So in my community, in the Asian community, and that's not monolithic, but in Nottingham, it's more, it's sort of smaller and narrower than it would be in a place like London or New York. So there are lots of socially conservative forces in the community, and they were mobilising particularly around LGBT inclusive relationship and sex education. So there were videos being made with some really sort of graphic, obscene, homophobic stuff. So I was very conscious of that, and also conscious of people who aren't necessarily themselves homophobic and biphobic and transphobic, but will pander to that for political gain or because they're too scared. And I thought, actually, no, it's my responsibility to be a representative of Nottingham East as my full self, as a socialist, as a woman of colour, as a young person, as someone from a working class background. And when I thought about people who don't have the privilege that I have as someone with a huge platform, I thought it's absolutely my duty to be here as my full self. So I represent people. I'm thinking of someone in particular who is at risk of so-called honour-based violence from her family because of her sexuality. There are people who aren't safe to be out or are forced out of their families because of it. And we know that that is the case for so many LGBTQ plus youth. one of the things that I've found interesting, difficult to navigate has been sort of your identity as a queer person and as a person of colour means that there's quite a small constituency of people who you can feel completely safe with sometimes. Not completely, because we all share solidarity in different ways, but I've found queer people of colour and that community to particularly be a source of solidarity for me, because there's racism from the wider LGBTQ community and wider society that you have to deal with. And then there's social conservatism and homophobia from communities of colour that you have to deal with. And it can feel like quite a responsibility to be batting things off from all sides and actually saying, come on, like we are marginalised and oppressed in different ways, and we have to come together and unite and stand with each other in our different struggles. And I think that's been particularly the case around trans rights and the way that that has been weaponised as being, you know, trans women are somehow snatching away rights from cisgender women, or the rights of trans people are somehow in conflict with the rights of other LGBTQ plus people. And interestingly, actually, I probably get more hate from transphobes than I do from the far right, which is indicative of just how entrenched transphobia has become and how sort of amplified it's become in the past year or few years.
That's great. I'm going to pose a question from Zain Marib in a second, who's a professor here in the States. But let me first ask you this role modeling question. One of the things that I find very moving in the stories of LGBTQ plus elected officials are those moments, sometimes and often private moments, when somebody comes to you and sort of says, your visibility has meant this to me. It's been so important. And I use often the terms, the kid from Altoona story. The kid from Altoona was, you know, when Harvey Milk was first elected, he got a phone call 2 days after he was elected, and the voice was quite young, and it was from Altoona, Pennsylvania. And that kid just said, thank you, in 1978, because he had no role models. He had no visible legitimizing people. And Harvey Milk suddenly, thousands of miles away, had become one for him. And Harvey Milk then wrapped that story into his famous Hope speech, The Kid from Altoona. And I wonder, and I know all of you have only been in office for a relatively short time, but do you have those moments where people say to you, my child, myself, my uncle, my daughter, you have done something that gives us legitimacy and hope? Any of you? Katie?
Yeah. One of the most rewarding and fulfilling, and I felt important things that I did while I was on the campaign trail, but also, you know, throughout the time that I was in office and after, was going to schools and high schools, colleges, on and on. And particularly at the high schools in my community where I grew up, and like I said, which has been historically very conservative, has had a lot of anti you know, LGBT everything, right? Sex ed is it's none of that is taught. It's still very, you know, religiously based. It's but so I would often afterwards, you know, we'd have a discussion of whatever kind in a good larger group, and then afterwards I would have just kind of a line or a group of people who would want to come up to me and talk afterwards, and so many of them were queer kids who were and oftentimes I think trying to figure out their identity, but saying that feeling like the fact that I was out, the fact that I talked about it, and that I came from the same community that they're in, where they feel like they're not even sure if they can tell their parents, or they can, you know, talk about it with their friends or talk about it in school. They said that it makes them feel like it's possible. And to me, that's just everything. And so the other day I was talking to somebody who's thinking about running for office, and he kept asking, like, is it worth it? Given everything that you've been through, is it worth it? And, is it worth it for what you can do for your district? And I said, if it's just about what policies you're going to be able to pass, or if you're going to be able to get money for X, Y, and Z project, then I can't say with my own experience that part is worth it. But the part that is knowing what you mean to other people, especially when you're representing a community that has not had that kind of a voice before. And for me specifically, it was the LGBTQ community, especially for young people. And that still matters so much for me today.
Sarah?
No, I was just gonna add on that. One of my favorite memories from the some of my favorite memories from the campaign, and then some of my favorite memories just doing movement work, was meeting so many young LGBTQ people. And what I love about young LGBTQ people is it's just this burst of gender diversity, unashamed, incredibly proud, incredibly open, and the fluidity of it all just, I think, lives in them in such an inspiring way for me as now a LGBTQ adult. And throughout the campaign, I'd receive text, video messages from young trans kids who were just wishing me on, from Delaware, but also from Ohio and Washington State and California. And that was always really meaningful to me, because when you're in the campaign and you're sort of in the slog of the campaign and you're not thinking every single day about, how my identities may, empower or provide comfort to someone, you're sort of just thinking about, how do I talk to as many voters as possible? It's that helpful reminder as you're going through that about the unique responsibility, burdens, but also privilege of being a candidate whose election in and of itself accomplishes something. And so that was always incredibly inspiring for me. And to now see those young people who I've met over the last few years using their own voices. One of my good friends who I met 4 years ago, young queer trans woman, now 16, she was 12 or 13 when I met her. She just testified in front of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee in favor of the Equality Act. And so to now see those same young people who I've been able to watch grow into their identities, into their voices over the last 4 years, really come into their own and now take their rightful place at the table is, for me, one of the most inspiring parts of being in this field and doing this work.
Annie, Nadia, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably all the same, that those messages and people messaging you and things are nothing is, those are, I think, the more important things sometimes than any of the other things that you do. People sending you messages. And I used to run this thing called Pink Training, which is one of the biggest LGBT youth kind of weekend training events. I think we haven't found one of its size or anything. It's really quite large. And so there's people who I would have met at that event 6-7 years ago. I first went to it in 2009, never knowing that I would end up like this. And and they messaged, they would get in touch then after, when I got elected to the council, then when I got elected to the Senate, and they were like, it's you stood up and you spoke at that event, and now we see you getting elected to something, and that's, I think, very meaningful. I think that representation is important, and for people to not to see that things can happen. In Ireland, we don't really actually necessarily gender and sexual. People are kind of like, whatever. We kind of suddenly went. We did the Gender Recognition Act and marriage equality like at the same time. We just went bada bing, bada boom, great. And now everyone was like, we're having a great time. We're super resistant of the culture wars coming in from the UK. We're very firm against that getting in here. We're like, wait, shoot. No, we won't have it. So there's a big resistance happening amongst a group of us feminists, and we're just like, get out. So on the one hand, in Ireland, like during the general election, which was an absolute disaster for me, I got absolutely slammed. But no one cared. Some people cared about getting a woman in, but no one really cared about sexual orientation or gender identity. It was only afterwards then that it's like a corrective, because actually it is important and it is significant. So I feel like it's kind of trying to make a significance out of it, because I think it's really important for young people, as that's always been my thing, to be able to reach and to see someone that they can reach out to as well. I don't know that I would have ever reached out to any of the out politicians before. So I think it's really great that myself, and there's a couple of other ones in at the moment who I know would be very willing to talk to young people when they reach out to us, and to older people as well. And I think that's a really important part of our politics. It's not just policy and stuff, but actually being a politician involves living your politics as well.
Great, thank you. Nadia.
I agree really strongly with what you just said, Annie, about being a politician is about living your politics, not sort of just having your political ideology as being something that's abstract and separate from yourself and your actions. I mean, when I was elected, I kind of ticked a lot of firsts. So I was like the first person of colour to represent Nottingham, which was pretty shocking to happen so late, because it's a very diverse city, ethnically diverse city. I'm like, technically the first Gen Z MP, although like the Gen Zers born after 2000 would probably like have my scalp for that. I think that representation is really important, and I often get those messages and they make me cry, and it's very much a reciprocal inspiration, because I was sort of I came from movement politics, and that's what I'm still plugged into and kind of continue to be led by and inspired by. It really concerns me that we haven't yet in the UK had a single openly trans MP, and it feels a little bit jarring to be congratulated for kind of just doing the minimum, really. And the fact that we don't have trans MPs to speak for themselves, not just on trans rights, but also leading, you know, everything from climate change to, well, the fight against climate change to, you know, the ways in which every political issue, from healthcare to education to homelessness, disproportionately often impacts trans people. I think though, and we see this in the UK a lot, because we've had two female prime ministers. The Home Secretary is a woman of colour from an immigrant family. We see the limitations of representation politics, and that you could have a whole parliament of queer people, of people of colour, of second generation and first generation immigrants, creating the most oppressive laws. So yes, we need Parliament to be more representative, but actually having us being in Parliament is not in itself enough, and that is not going to change anything until we have cultural and material change, because until then, being represented at the top doesn't mean anything for trans people in the workplace. It doesn't mean anything for people of colour being physically attacked in the workplace, for homeless LGBTQ people, for sex workers who are being attacked, because we have such awful laws around sex work that don't keep people safe, the hostile environment that is responsible for LGBT people being deported back to abusers or back to countries where they're going to be killed. So we need that deep systematic change.
And that leads us to some of the great questions that are coming in. You've touched upon a number of issues about seeing policies through different lenses and transformation of the state. And there are some great questions I'm going to get to. The first question is by Zain Marib, who's actually writing a book on bisexual politicians around the world. And she notes that in her findings, it seems like bisexual political actors are distinguishing themselves by forging alliances across groups, particularly with other trans, lesbian, gay, trans people of color. And in some ways that may be different to some of the mainstream lesbian and gay organizations that are not as able or historically have not been as good at forging alliances. So do you think that there is something distinctive about identities that are bisexual and pansexual that perhaps gives you space to forge alliances beyond that community?
You know, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but I wonder if it's because part of us has not entirely felt like we belong to a single community, even the LGBTQ community. That's not something that I felt like I was always accepted to. And so it wasn't the single place that I kind of hung on to the most, or singularly hung out with, right? So I don't know if that's a piece of it, or if it's something that where you just recognize that you need to go across different lines to be able to accomplish things. I'm not sure if that's where it comes from, but yeah, I'm interested in everyone else's thoughts on this.
And Nadia just mentioned this issue about seeing broader social change through different lenses. We have a question about, are there issues that are not necessarily obviously LGBTQ issues, but the lens you're bringing to it is something that is fresh and different and helpful, just because it's being looked at through a queer lens? Are there issues that you're dealing with in Parliament or state houses today that you think would benefit from a different lens of approach?
I think every issue. I mean, I think it's to Nadia's point too, representation in and of itself doesn't achieve change. But we also know that in order to address the multitude of challenges we're facing, at minimum, as a starting point, we need diversity of voices at the table. And so it's merely a foundation and by no means a solution. And I think Nadia's point is so well taken. And Nadia mentioned a number of the intersecting issues, I think, that we bring that queer lens to. Two that certainly come top to mind for me. One is I'm drafting and about to introduce our Democratic majority's paid family and medical leave law here in Delaware. And one of the big conversations we're having is around the definition of family. And the push, one of the areas of pushback I'm receiving is around a definition that sort of has an open-ended component that incorporates the full range of family structures, chosen family, that communities of color, that LGBTQ people disproportionately are part of. And so engaging in that conversation, I bring a certain understanding of the need for that kind of expansive definition that I clearly see, if maybe intellectually understood by the people that I'm negotiating with, is certainly not deeply felt. And then the other example I feel I see this very clearly is around prisons and incarceration. The chair of our Public Safety and Corrections Committee is a queer Black woman, and I'm on that committee alongside her. We're a small chamber, so we've got only 4 Democrats on that committee. So half of the majority caucus, including the chair of that committee, are queer. And I am sure that prior to our time in the legislature, we were both just elected in November, legislators were not meeting with the Department of Corrections to both push forward and ensure true implementation of LGBTQ inclusive practices, but quite literally also checking up on very specific individuals who are incarcerated, particularly trans individuals who are incarcerated, to routinely ask about their welfare, their health, their safety, and to ensure that that's a priority for our Department of Corrections. And so in those 2 instances, but in others as well, I'm seeing really, really profoundly the importance, and not the solution, but the importance of having those diverse voices in our community represented at the table.
Thank you. I have another question from a attendee, which I think is a powerful question. It's very complex and big, but I want to pose it to you. It says, as an Arab American who's a socialist, I think a lot about how social conservatism, including homophobia in all of its forms, hinders progress for working class people. What are some strategies for building solidarity or overcoming those obstacles? Nadia.
I've got a lot of thoughts about this. This is a really important question. So I think that this kind of in the UK as well as in the US, and fortunately not yet in Ireland, because you've built built a wall would be totally the wrong kind of phrase to use, but you're keeping the culture war out from across the channel, so well done. But I think that there is a culture war, that is the intention behind that is to divide working class people in all of our diversity. And one of the things that I've spoken about from a UK perspective has been the importance of us in the Labour Party not pandering to that culture war. So in the UK, in the last election in 2019, the Labour Party lost lots of seats called so-called red wall seats, which are characterised as being white working class seats that are therefore supposedly inherently regressive. And then the danger is that parties make policies to sort of cater and pander to the lowest common denominator, to cater to these imagined regressive views. So without sort of wanting to look at working class history through rose-tinted glasses, I do think it's important that we draw on examples of solidarity that we've seen throughout history. So in the UK, in South Wales during the miners' strike, communities that were very traditional and homophobia was rife, there was solidarity between miners and LGBTQ plus people, with lesbian and gays support the miners' strike. In a place called Bradford in the north of the country, when Asian people were being beaten up by fascists, their white working class neighbours stood with them in solidarity. Of course, there are examples of racism within working class communities, but I think it's really important that we focus on those examples of solidarity and how we build from there, and basically make the argument that, to put it really crudely and bluntly, that the class war and the culture war is one and the same, and we've got to fight them both together.
I wanted to raise a question that's been posed by A. Campbell, which is obviously a crucial and present issue in a number of countries right now, about trans participation in sports at various levels. Trans athletes, athletic participation has become a political issue in the United States. What can politicians, both in the US and around the world, do to support access to competition and participation, eliminating discrimination? Athletics is often a mirror of society. Trans participation is important. So how are you handling these increasing attentive issues on trans participation in sports in your various cases?
I mean, I don't know who wants to start with this, because this has been an issue that since we passed, as Sarah mentioned earlier, since we passed the Equality Act 2 years ago, that was the motion to recommit that the Republicans used to try and stop the act from passing, and I think they just came upon something that for some reason has a visceral reaction among certain groups. And I was shocked when I went, home and talked to some people about it, that people I never would have expected to kind of fall on a certain side of this, that I think are generally accepting and fairly liberal, the Republicans or the conservatives managed to get into their heads in a way that made it seem logical that, of course I don't want my high school daughter to compete with somebody who has, who has an edge, right? Or who makes it an unfair playing field. And they made that sound so reasonable to people that I knew growing up, that I found we fundamentally have to break that down to really make sure that people know that this is not an issue. It is a made up issue. It is not one that has really ever had an impact in any way, shape, or form, and that the individual the individual sports and institutions are capable of setting rules that work, that are effective, and that have been made by bringing groups together. but this is a boogeyman. It's yet another boogeyman. And I don't know what the answer can be, except for shutting it down, right? And recognizing that they are simply just going to try to find these kinds of things. I mean, it was bathrooms, probably will continue to be bathrooms, at least in some places. And now it's this sports piece, and it's fear mongering, and it's hateful, and we just have to say no.
Sarah?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think one thing that is just so critical is what Katie did on the floor of the House of Representatives, which is being a cisgender woman, just literally having no patience for the BS of the argument. And that was so powerful to see, and I think really profoundly sort of shuts down the conversation in certain instances. I think other strategies that I'm seeing the movement increasingly use surround, one, really trying to stress, particularly since these are bills that target young people, the social component of sport, the social component of playing on a team and being part of something bigger than yourself. And that, I think, has been some helpful messaging around sort of just like, let kids play. I think another critical part, of course, is also filling the void that exists around who trans people are, and then specifically who trans young people are. And I think having trans young people share their stories and tell their stories through the perspective of their experience being part of a team, playing a sport, making friends through that, learning the power of teamwork. That is a really, I think, effective way of bringing both the specific messaging around the sort of social integration component, but also just filling that knowledge gap that exists, that provides an inability to empathize, filling that, and really having trans youth's voices at the heart of that conversation. And then, you know, the final thing, I think Katie's so right. I mean, they have sort of stumbled upon a really effective tool here. It goes right to the heart of, it somehow makes people's, with the bathroom argument, a person's sex assigned at birth, people were like, that at the end of the day, it does feel irrelevant to people. For some, this feels relevant to people. It's a misunderstanding of realities and science and data, and it's a made up controversy. But I think it's hit that note. And I think another successful thing that Katie mentioned here is articulating how made up this crisis is. Like, at a time of a global pandemic where workers' wages have remained stagnant, if not dropped, where women are seeing a 10-year regression in the workforce, at a time where people are literally dying at record numbers, this is what you're focusing on, Republicans in state legislatures. I think that's a helpful juxtaposition to sort of shame them for their prioritization of this. It's absurd.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we're at a hard stop at 1 o'clock because some of our panelists have other things they have to go to, but we greatly appreciate everybody in attendance. This is very much a beginning of a conversation. I think we're going to have a lot more conversations about bi and pan dimensions of politics and public policy. I hope that we can do this in person soon. I know Katie and I are planning a trip to London to do some of these events later on, perhaps in December of this year. And we want to, and if Sarah, if you want to come too, you can come too, Sarah. That's fine. And so we will begin this conversation, continue this conversation, and thank you everybody for being a fabulous role model. I really am inspired and constantly impressed by the panelists that we have with us today, and I wish you well in your future careers. So thank you all, and we will speak again and keep on fighting a good fight. So bye-bye, everybody. And Nadia, in answer to your question, yes, let me start an email thread and we can start trying to coordinate more. I mean, on the trans issue, I know the APPG have been, I was part of a meeting where they were talking to some trans scholars in the United States about what's going on here. And we're also trying to understand more about the relationship between anti-trans groups funding and strategizing in Britain
Yeah, it would be really good to talk offline about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go into more detail offline, but it would be really good to talk about that. If you could set up an email thread, that would be awesome.
No, that's super. And I know Anna will help facilitate that as well. So great. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you so much for having us. It was amazing.
Cheers. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Bye, everyone.